This is communication. And the power of good communication is that it transmits a message or a meaning without many words. And that is what good branding, design, marketing does. Our next speaker is an expert in this, as he calls himself a brand activist. An architect by education, he actually bridges design, strategy, and activism to transform complex challenges like climate change into actionable solutions. The story he is about to share is nothing less but a step-to-step guide that illustrates how one communication campaign actually managed to turn the entire Danish building industry around. It is also the story of one person who might have felt lonely in his frustration and stepped into action to actually mobilize many through that. Please welcome on stage Kasper Reimer Bjørkskov.
Hi everyone. I'm not an activist, I'm an architect. And originally I became an architect because I wanted to make people's lives better. But that's not what the industry does today. It's a main driver of climate breakdown, and it's really, really neglecting the people it's meant to serve. That's why I was so happy when I met this pledge. This is Architecture Declare. It's a global pledge for architects to take climate action. So I quickly sort of wrote them and said, what do I need to do? What actions do I need to take? How can I be a part of this? And then came the very, very disappointing answer. Nothing. Just sign up, and then that's all good. And I was like, okay. I got frustrated because this is exactly how the status quo is kept alive. These commitments makes it seem like there's progress, but in reality it's nothing but empty promises. So I really wrote an angry post on social media, and then I asked if anyone wanted to be in on figuring out what it would mean to create a transition in the building industry that would actually ensure that we could enable this climate neutral transition. And for a long time there was just crickets. I was like, okay, I'm the only one with this. But suddenly 2 messages ticked in, and that was the spark. The spark of a movement called the Reduction Roadmap. And it's a movement that's with a vision to align the Danish building industry with the latest climate science and enable the transition towards a sustainable future. And to our surprise, we were actually quite successful, because this is the first time in Danish history that the entire building industry has come together, not to fight legislation, but to demand it. So how do we get here? And we have to rewind a bit, because to understand how we could enable this change, we also have to understand how our degenerative system works. So we live in a broken system. 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been broken. And billions of people live outside of decent living conditions, not having access to water, food, or even shelter. So how is it that we came to serve a system that promised us prosperity, but in reality is accelerating us towards collapse? To understand this, we must understand how power works and how it shapes our opinion. So in 1777, a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, says something striking. Nothing appears more surprising than the easiness of which the many are governed by the few. Why is it that billions live by the rules that are set by a small elite? His answer was quite simple. Power doesn't rest on force, it rests on opinion. And actually, 2 decades later, Anthony Gramsci sits in his prison cell in Italy saying that power endures by shaping culture. And it's that the powerful that maintain control by shaping opinion. So I just want to help, you need to help me illustrate something. Can any of you just raise your hand if you ever felt guilty for resting? Felt guilty for not working hard enough? Felt guilty for not being productive enough? Okay, look around, you're not alone. And I think that's the trick. This is not natural. This is a story we've been taught to keep us obedient, because If you think your value is only what you produce, you will keep producing until it burns you out or till you break the planet. And that's the entire point, is that power doesn't need any change when it governs us from within. And nowhere in this shaping opinion more evident than in the role of capitalism and neoliberalism. And then you might think, oh, that's just a natural progression of the system. That's just how we have evolved. But it's actually not. This is manipulated and forced. Because after the Second World War, the elites didn't fear more war, they feared democracy. Because democracy means shared power. So what did they do? They set out to not build an army, but build an idea. Redefine freedom. Freedom is the market, and tyranny is the government. And so they hired a small elite of economists, politicians, scientists, journalists to run think tanks, infiltrate universities, and even infiltrate media companies. All with that same story, is that freedom is for market, not for people. And they did quite well. It wasn't really super successful, but in the 70s, a crisis came. So the oil crisis in the 70s, and then a stagflation in the UK. And what do politicians do when they look for solutions? When there's a crisis, they look for solutions. And there they were, ready-made, the neoliberal doctrine entered not through force, but through ballots with Thatcher and Reagan. So this is small group of elites is now a global network called the Atlas Network, spanning 3,000 think tanks. And they have these tactics that we see them everywhere. It's delay. So Exxon knew about climate change in 1973, but they buried the evidence. And then it's deflect. BP invented the carbon footprint to make it about your personal choices, not about their emissions. And then they distract. So they create fake reports that make it seem like climate change is not that bad. And if you're unaware, this is the report that came out 2 months ago from the White House. This is how bad it all had become. So what does this story actually teach us? It teaches us how a small elite could take an idea from the margins all the way into the mainstream, reshaping how culture works, how our economic system works, and even our understanding of what freedom means. But if it's been done before, we can do it again. Not to centralize power, but to redistribute it. Because this is the lesson. If you want to change something, start with changing minds. The most powerful revolutions didn't start in boardrooms or in parliaments. They start in the stories we choose to believe. So how do we then enable this change? We first have to understand why we are failing to mobilize. We've been told the story that if we communicate fear, then people will become paralyzed. So we shouldn't do that. And politicians say it, and media enforces it. But in reality, the science is clear. If we communicate fear, guilt, and moral communication, and pair it with actionable steps for what people need to do, it's far more effective at mobilizing. And we know this already, because if you get a cancer diagnosis from a doctor, it's not a hopeful message. It's fearful, but it might be the single thing that prompts you to change course, to stop smoking, and to revisit how you live your life. And to understand why we need to break this conformity, we need to look at two psychological traits. One is called social conformity, the other one is called the bystander effect. And in the 1960s, two university professors did a study called the smoke-filled room experiment. They put a person into a room without them knowing that they slowly entered smoke through the room. When people were alone, 9 out of 10 reported the smoke within 6 minutes. And then they ran the experiment one more time. But this time, they put a group of actors they were instructed to sit still while the smoke was seeping through into the room. And what happened? 1 out of 10 reported the smoke. And had it been in real life, they would have all been killed. And that's the thing. That's the two psychological forces at play. The bystander effects tell us that we spread responsibility out evenly. So if no one is reacting, I'm also not going to react. And then secondly, the social conformity. We don't like to break social conformity. We like to do what everyone else does. We don't want to be the odd one out. So we stick to our guns until say nothing. And we see this everywhere. So there's a climate breakdown almost on the news every day, yet we stay silent and we do nothing. And this is why it's so important to communicate the truth and communicate the science, even though it's fearful. Because we need to understand that when we break conformity, shifts happen. Because when fear is paired with action, it doesn't freeze us, it fuels us. But of course, it starts with speaking up, but it's not enough. If we want to propel people to actually do something, we have to understand how social norms are actually created. And we used to think that social norms are something that come from above, it's rules or punishment or sort of social change within our small group, and it's not. We know that it's the signals around us, it's the information environment we have. So it's the stories we hear, it's the behavior that is visible, it's the institution that legitimizes these things, and at the end, it's also the identity we choose to take on. And the cool thing is that we know from the countries that have been successful in getting people to smoke less, what happened? Was it a new study? No. Was it more information? No, it wasn't. It happened when heroes stopped smoking in movies, when we banned it from restaurants and cafes, when we made it much more expensive to buy cigarettes. So if change depends on this changing the signal around us and not just what we know, it also helps us explain why we are so bad at mobilizing, because we keep assuming that values leads to action. We just need to know a little more, then our values change, and then action happens. But in reality, it's the other way around. Is that action shape values, and that's the best way to understand this. Is that think of it like this: it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting. But of course, it's not either or; it's both. But we have to understand the sequencing. Action ignites, reflection sustains, and that's how it is. It's not either or, but it's how we combine them and how we understand how the sequencing and how they work. And change is not a loop, it's a spiral that could be either positive or negative. So our point is that we need to change the information systems around us that prompts a new action, that enables reflections, that then turns into value change, and then prompts new action. And I'm sorry, but this is a significant problem if we understand it this way to the IDG principles. Because if action shape our values, we got the sequencing wrong. We need to go from action that enables collaboration, which fosters relation and ensures thinking, and then ultimately ends up at being. So, but because we get what we act on, not what we dream of. And we need to remember this, because it's so important. We don't need more insights, we need more action. But even when we shape our values, so now we said that we have to speak up, we have to understand how norms work, and then we have a value shift when we act. And that is also true. But we have to be aware of something quite fundamental, is that we don't absorb values passively, we bend them to fit our identity. So that's the kicker. We need to understand how identity is formed. And this is a quite striking example, because in 2024, the biggest part of Republicans said that they would never elect a convicted felon. What happened when Donald Trump was elected? They directly flipped. And this is because the value of not electing a convicted felon was secondary to the identity of being a Republican. So this isn't hypocrisy, and we see it in Democrats as well, so it's not just a Republican thing. But it's the cognitive dissonance that we believe our beliefs are not carved in stone. They're sticky notes that we use to rewrite who we think we are. And this is really important, because facts alone rarely change mind, but identity does. That's why branding is so important, because it's the engineering of identity. Branding is about shaping desires through identity. It tells us who we are and who we would like to become. It's a simple formula: sell identity first, outcome second. And it helps us explain why climate campaigns are so shit at this. I'm sorry, but but because we keep selling planetary boundaries, net zero, tipping points, they're all factually true, but it doesn't move anyone. That's why Nike never sold shoes. They sold the idea of becoming an athlete. And UN sells us facts we wish we didn't know. And I hope you can see the difference. And this is actually what the Atlas Network mastered. Because what they did was that they didn't sell an idea, they sold an identity. So when we understand this, we can also use it to really figure out what to do next. How do we reverse the playbook? How do we use this for the common good? So here are 5 sort of simple things we learned during the campaign that helped us enable this systemic change. So direction turns small steps into systemic change. So movements like to think that we need systemic change tomorrow because otherwise it's not good enough. But that's not how systems change. They gradually tip. So we need to have a clear direction, understand where to go, and take the best adjacent possible route. And this requires compromise and reconciliation. And it's very difficult to get this in movements, but we need it. So in reduction roadmap, we knew that we had to reduce how many buildings we built, actually quite significantly. But we could not get an industry mobilized around that. It was simply impossible. So we said, we need to mobilize around getting emission caps on how much buildings can emit that is in line with the climate science. So that was the first adjacent step. I'll tell you later why this matters. And then we turned minority insights into majority action. So we took insight out of old dusty PDF written for experts and turned it into something that everyone could understand. And that's the key. When you take complex insights and make it accessible for people, they can create agency. And when people have agency, they act. And then we branded it as something different. We didn't brand it as yet another activist campaign where you just have to do all these things. We branded it for conservative industry that everyone could see themselves in. And in this way, we reduce risk. And then, now we knew what we had to actually mobilize around. We knew how it had to be communicated. But how do we then mobilize? So many campaigns focus on getting the center of power to move. But the thing is that the center never moves because they are dependent on status quo. So it's about mobilizing periphery. And we know from science that when 25% of a group adopts a new norm, the rest follow suit. And that's a super important lesson because it means that we shouldn't go for convincing everyone. We should go for convincing the people that are actually likely to support our cause. So that's what we did. We invited 40 of the most progressive people in the entire value chain in for the building industry. We told them what we were going to do, asked for their input, and ensured their endorsement. So what happened was that when we went live with it, it seemed like there was a huge momentum, and all these immediately joined, and it moved the entire periphery to then ultimately move the middle. And then we did something else. We made what we asked of them simple, emotional, beneficial, and actionable. We made it simple and emotional because we said that please support that our new legislation of new builds is at adherence with the Paris Accord. And when we did this, we inadvertently said, if you don't support this, you don't support the Paris Accord. And that's a thing that most companies can't afford to say. And then when they then signed up, we made it beneficial and actionable. Then they got us a graphic with their logo on that they could share with the rest of the industry. Not through our campaign, but through their own voice. And when people share these things through their own voice, with their own communication, it starts feeling less like a campaign and more like a cultural shift. And then lastly, in a world where everyone is overburdened with problems and we are stressed, we're really, really stressed, we don't need more problems, we need solutions. So what we said is that okay, for the building industry professional, we found all the cases that proved that this emission cap was possible and said it's even going to be a competitive advantage. For the bigger industry, we showed that before we had very harsh regulation, which had enabled some of the biggest companies in the world, which is Grundfos, Danfoss, and which actually came out of our harsh legislation. And then for the politician, we calculated how much CO2 this campaign would save if it was enforced. And then we said it's going to make it so much easier to live up to the Paris Accord. And that changes everything. So that's how we took an idea from the margins to the mainstream. And now over 900 companies have signed up, and it's by far the majority of building industry workplaces that is supporting this. So it's a united industry. What else happened is that we reduced the emission caps for new build, but the most important thing that I'm so proud of, you remember when I said we couldn't run a campaign on reducing how much we built? 3 years later now, there's a huge building stop movement in Denmark, and for the parliament elections coming up now, it's endorsed by 2 political parties. So what was before impossible is now possible. And that's how you create the gradual systemic shifts. And this is actually the most important lesson. If you take one thing away, please take this away. Because no company can do this alone, or organization. If we had asked individual actors to just follow the reduction roadmap that we set out, they would have been outcompeted by other companies that didn't give a rat's ass about this. But the thing is that when we united everyone to create legislation change, it evens the playing field and it turns a weakness into a strength. This is the way out of the multipolar trap. Enable collective action for systemic change. So what began as a frustrated, really annoyed architect's post on social media became something much bigger. And it taught me something, that a single act, a single post, a single thing of courage really can set ripple in motion that changes the entire system. So please speak up, even if your voice shakes. Good.
Thank you so much, Kasper, for sharing this truly impressive story. And I get the impression if you ever want to put out a social media post again, it might probably go viral quite quickly.
Hopefully.
I wonder, in one of our conversations we had before this talk, you said that we cannot change everything we face, but what we face can change us.
Yeah.
And I wonder, since you've basically faced the entire Danish building industry, how has that process changed you?
I think it changed me in a quite profound way, because I was running a research lab before doing this mobilization, and I thought that more knowledge, we just needed to talk more about it, then we would have the change. But it was when we did the action that I really felt like we could do a difference. So for me, it really changed the mindset. It's like, it's not about just, it's important to have the reflection, it's important to have the insights, but most important is to go out and live it and try to be in it, because otherwise you never get these insights. Had we not done this, had we just kept it a roadmap we had sent out and not done the mobilization, we would have gotten nowhere. It would have been yet another PDF we just throw out into the air that hope people will catch. So that's what I learned.
Thank you so much that you actually showed your frustration and you mobilized the entire industry. Please give it up once more for Kasper Reimer Bjørkskov.